You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Hello, Nacho Knots, and welcome back to Nachos, the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. I am so glad that you guys are here. And before we step fully into June, I want to pause for a little bit of joy. This week, through the Humanities 101 Foundation, we gave away 2 tickets to Kesha as part of our summer concert ticket giveaway. And I love that because here on Nachos, we talk about big, meaningful things: neurodivergence, disability, access, masculinity, education, culture, care, community, and what it means to be a human. But joy belongs here too. Music belongs here. Having something fun to look forward belongs to here. Moments of celebration, connection, and delight are not separate from the work that we do. They are a part of the work. And the good news is that the summer ticket giveaway is still live. So if you want to enter for a chance to win tickets to the upcoming shows at Pine Knob Music Theater this summer, head over to humanities101.org/giveaway and sign up. That's it. Go enter, share it with someone who could use a night of music and joy, and help us keep building this community one good thing at a time. And somehow, here we are again, standing on the edge of June. And June always feels like a doorway. Not quite the beginning of the year anymore. Not quite the deep middle of summer yet. And it's what I think of as a threshold month. A month that asks us to notice what has grown, what has shifted, what has survived, and what still needs tending. The school year is ending for most, or it has ended for many. Routines are changing. Schedules are loosening. The days are stretching out. The light lingers a little longer in the evening, almost as if the world itself is saying, you do not have to rush into darkness quite yet. And for neurodivergent folks, that change can be complicated because June can look beautiful from the outside. Sunshine, cookouts, graduations, open windows, farmers markets, trip to the lake, kids out of school, people posting their vacations and their patio drinks and their summer reset plans. But inside of our actual lives, June can feel less like a postcard and more like a system update that we did not consent to. One of those ones that happen in the middle of the night that mess up all your stuff and you wake up. Suddenly, the schedule is different. The demands are different. The noise is different. The expectations are different. The world says, relax, it's just summer. And our nervous systems say, excuse me, but everything has just changed. So before we rush into this month with a list of things we're supposed to become, we're supposed to accomplish, fix, organize, launch, clean, improve, or finally get around to, I want to invite us to begin June with something gentler. Not a resolution, not a productivity sprint, not a self-improvement campaign wearing sunglasses. Just a pause, a breath, a little check-in with ourselves. What did spring ask of you? What did you carry? What did you survive? What parts of you are tired in ways that a single good night of sleep will not fix? And what small piece of joy, steadiness, or softness might June be able to offer you? Because maybe June does not have to be a command. Maybe June is an invitation to step outside for 5 minutes and feel the sun on your face, an invitation to drink water before your body has to send a strongly worded email, an invitation to let some things be unfinished without treating that as personal failure, an invitation to remember that rest is not something you have to earn after you've become useful enough, productive enough. Rest is part of the human condition. It's part of being human. And Nacho Knots, if May has left you feeling scattered, June does not require you to arrive perfectly assembled. You're allowed to enter this month gently or even roughly. You're allowed to need structure in a season that celebrates spontaneity. You're allowed to enjoy summer and still feel overwhelmed by it. You're allowed to be grateful for the light and still need shade. So as we begin this episode, let's not ask, how do I become a whole new person this summer? Let's ask something kinder. What would help me feel a little more human this week? What would give my nervous system one small signal of safety? What would make this season feel less like something I have to perform and more like something I'm allowed to inhabit? That feels like a good place to begin. Because here at Nachos, we believe that healing doesn't always arrive as a grand transformation. Sometimes it arrives as a glass of water, a quiet room, a text from someone who gets it, a plan that gives your brain one less thing to hold, a moment where you remember, I am not behind, I am simply becoming. So welcome to June. Not as a deadline, not as a demand, but as a doorway. And you don't have to sprint through it. You can step through gently, and maybe that's where June gives us a useful kind of mirror. Because when the seasons shift, it's easy to start comparing. Who's traveling more? Who looks happier? Who seems more productive? Who has the better body, the better schedule, the better summer, the better life? And comparison is sneaky, Nacho Knots. It can dress itself up like motivation, but often it's just shame wearing a Fitbit. And that's why I often come back to this Ernest Hemingway quote, time and time again. There is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self. So again, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self. And whether we're talking about summer, self-care, neurodivergence, recovery, growth, or just getting through another week with a little more tenderness, that line matters. Because the goal is not to become better than someone else. The goal is not to win June. The goal is not to outperform the next person to you, out-heal your friends, outwork your colleagues, or turn your life into a highlight reel with better lighting. The goal is to become a little more honest with yourself than you used to be, a little more compassionate with yourself and others, a little more aware of your limits, a little more willing to ask for what you need, a little more able to say, the old version of me did the best they could with what they knew, and this version of me now is allowed to choose something completely different. That's true nobility, not dominance, not superiority, not hustle culture with an inspirational quote slapped on top, but growth with grace. The kind of growth that says, I'm not here to defeat anyone. I'm here to become more fully myself. And that idea feels especially important as we turn from the beginning of June towards what comes next. Because June is not just a doorway into summer. For me, this June is also a month of preparation. It's a month of gathering thoughts, organizing stories, building language, and getting ready for July, which is Disability Pride Month. Just as June is another form of Pride Month. And in July, for Disability Pride Month, it's not about pretending every barrier has been removed, and it's not about turning disability into a slogan and then ignoring the systems that make disabled life harder than it needs to be. I mean, we see that in Crip Camp for the midterm. Disability Pride is about dignity. It's about visibility. It's about truth-telling. It's about saying that disabled people do not need to become less disabled to be more worthy to belong. And that connects directly with Hemingway's idea of true nobility. Because the work of disability pride is not about proving we are superior to anyone or just like anyone. It's not about winning respect by becoming exceptional enough to be tolerated. It's about becoming more honest, more grounded, more committed to the truth that our worth was never up for debate in the first place. And that's why I'm especially honored to be preparing for the Breaking Barriers celebration again in Lansing, Michigan on July 23rd, 2026. This event is with the MiDDC and Self Advocates of Michigan. And that phrase, breaking barriers, matters because barriers do not break themselves. They're challenged by people who tell the truth, by self-advocates who refuse to be hidden, by families, allies, educators, organizers, and community members who decide that access is not a favor. It's a responsibility. So as we move through June, I'm not thinking about preparation. I'm thinking about preparation, but not as pressure. I'm thinking about it as practice. Practice in listening. Practice in honoring disabled leadership. Practice in making space for stories that too often get dismissed, softened, or even spoken over. Practice in remembering that pride is not the absence of struggle. Pride is what happens when we stop treating our struggle as shame. And maybe that is the bridge from June to July, Nacho Knots. We begin gently. We stop comparing here in June. We measure growth by compassion instead of conquest, and then we carry that compassion outward into community, into advocacy, into celebration, and into the work of breaking barriers together. Think about it. We begin gently. We stop comparing. We measure growth by compassion instead of conquest. And then, at least for me, that preparation stretches even further outward into the work that I'm doing for my upcoming Fulbright lectures on American culture for the 250th anniversary of the United States. Because when we talk about America at 250, we're not just talking about fireworks, flags, monuments, and museum plaques, although you'll see a lot of that this summer. We're talking about a living, unfinished story. We're talking about real people. We're talking about a country still wrestling with its promises. Freedom, equality, democracy, belonging, justice, access, voice. What do those mean in this country? What do those mean in the United States of America? And as I prepare these lectures, I keep thinking about who gets included in the story of America and who has too often been treated as a footnote. Disabled people have always been a part of the story. Neurodivergent people have always been a part of the country's story. Self-advocates, caregivers, organizers, teachers, students, workers, artists, and everyday people fighting for access have always been a part of the American story. So all of these things ask the same question. What kind of society are we building when we decide that belonging is not something that should have to be earned by becoming easier to include? That's the work I'm carrying on this summer. Not just looking back at America's history, but asking what kind of future are we willing to imagine? What kind of future are we willing to teach? And what kind of future are we willing to build together? And alongside that work, I'm also carrying another major project this summer, my upcoming book. I recently submitted and was approved by my publisher, or submitted my manuscript for my book deal to my publisher in the UK. And that feels like both an ending and a beginning. An ending because a manuscript represents months and months, even years of thinking, writing, revising, doubting, returning, and trying again. But it's also a beginning because now the work starts to move from something I've been carrying privately and with a few of you into something larger that will eventually belong to a larger conversation. And that larger conversation matters deeply to me. This book is part of the same mission that runs through NACHOS, through Disability Pride Month, my work with Sam, through the Breaking Barriers celebrations, and even my Fulbright work. It's about dignity. It's about humanity. It's about belonging. It's about telling more honest stories about neurodivergent lives, disabled lives, marginalized lives, and the systems that shape how people are seen, supported, misunderstood, and left out. So I hope you'll follow along and stay connected as the book journey continues. There are going to be updates, reflections, behind the scenes moments, and probably a few honest admissions about how strange and wonderful and overwhelming the whole publishing process can be. But more than anything, I hope this becomes another doorway for us to keep community building together. Because the book may have my name on the cover, but the work behind it belongs to something much bigger. The belief that every person deserves to be met with more understanding, more access, more compassion, and more room to become fully themselves. And I'll say this much as a little teaser. This book is about what happens when we stop treating neurodivergent boys and young men as problems to correct, performances to manage, or futures to fear. It's about autism, masculinity, tenderness, identity, shame, belonging, and the quiet damage that happens when boys are taught to hide the softest and most human parts of themselves. It asks what kind of men we might raise if we stopped confusing toughness with silence, independence with isolation, and confidence with emotional armor. At its heart, this book is about unmasking, not just unmasking neurodivergence, but unmasking the narrow stories we tell about manhood. The stories that say boys should toughen up instead of open up. The stories that mistake compliance for character. The stories that reward masking until it becomes burnout, loneliness, anger, or despair. But the book is not only about what harms us. It's also about what helps. It's about compassion as strength, repair as skill, access as love in action. It's about helping autistic and neurodivergent boys grow into kind, confident, emotionally honest people without asking them to abandon themselves along the way. So that's just a little preview. A book about raising boys without hardening them. A book about manhood without the mask. A book about building a world where tenderness is not treated like a weakness and difference is not treated like a defect. And that is why this next article from my research feels like a natural extension of the book, the work that we do here and our collective conversation. Because the American Psychological Association published an article called Rethinking Masculinity to Build Healthier Outcomes. And the article essentially asks the question that sits right at the heart of this work. What happens to boys and men when the rules of masculinity become too narrow for a human life? The article argues that rigid gender norms are taking a real toll on men's and boys' mental health, especially when masculinity is defined through emotional silence, dominance, self-reliance, toughness, and the rejection of anything seen as feminine. The APA frames the challenge not as, quote, men are bad, end quote, or, quote, masculinity is bad, end quote, but as a health issue. When boys are taught to disconnect from tenderness, vulnerability, friendship, and help seeking, they're cut off from some of the very things that make people resilient, that make them strong. And Nacho Knots, that matters. Because too often, conversations about masculinity get flattened into shouting matches. One side says men are in crisis, another side says men are the problem. And somewhere in the middle are actual boys, actual men, actual families, actual classrooms, friendships, and nervous systems trying to survive inside of the expectations that they did not invent. The more useful question we could ask is, how do we defend masculinity, or how do we destroy masculinity? Those would be foolish as well, if we think that's useful. What about this? What about a useful question like, what parts of masculinity help people become more whole? What parts teach them to disappear or shrink from themselves? And what can we do, right, to enhance the other or enhance the one and dissipate the other? Because I don't know about you, but I personally would like to reinforce the things that make me feel more whole and work on stopping those things that require me to disappear and hide and shirk from myself. And this is where the article connects so deeply to what we do. Because many autistic and ADHD boys are already told directly or indirectly that their natural way of being is too much, too intense, too sensitive, too emotional, too awkward, too weird, not mature enough, too mature. Then on top of that, they also receive the cultural messages that boys are supposed to be tough, independent, socially smooth, emotionally controlled, unbothered. And so now the mask gets a mask. And they're not just masking neurodivergence, they're masking manhood. They're masking pain. They're masking tenderness. They're masking confusion. They're masking confidence. They're masking the very needs that might help them stay connected, regulated, and alive. And this is where I think this APA article gives us a helpful opening. It points towards healthier masculinities rooted in emotional connection, authenticity, and realness. And that doesn't mean replacing one rigid script with another rigid script. It doesn't mean telling every boy and man to express emotions in the exact same way. It means expanding the menu of what is allowed. For some boys, emotional connection may look like talking face to face. For others, it may look like walking side by side. For others, it may look like playing a game, building something, making art, sending a meme, sitting quietly near someone safe, or finally saying, I do not know how to explain this, but I'm not okay. That's not weakness. That is access. That's the NACHOS connection. Because neuro-affirming care and healthier masculinity are both asking us to stop confusing performance with well-being. A boy who never cries is not automatically strong. A man who never asks for help is not automatically resilient. A student who never complains is not automatically fine. A person who has learned to shut down every visible sign of distress may not be well regulated. They're just simply well trained. So when we talk about raising boys without hardening them, this is what we mean. We're not trying to remove strength. We're trying to rescue strength from the tiny box it's been locked inside. Strength can repair. Strength can be honesty. Strength can be apologizing. Strength can be friendship. Strength can be asking for help before the wheels come off. Strength can be learning your own nervous system instead of declaring war on it. And maybe that's the deeper invitation of this article, Nacho Knots. Not to shame boys and men for the scripts they inherited, but to help them write wider ones. Not to mock masculinity, but to make room for forms of manhood that are more humane, more connected, more accountable, or more alive. Because true nobility, to borrow from that Hemingway line, is not being superior to someone else. It's becoming less afraid of your own humanity than you used to be. And that brings us to another part of the conversation, because it's not just psychologists, educators, parents, and advocates like me who are rethinking masculinity. Young people are too. A UCLA Center for Scholars and Storytellers report found that Gen Z and Gen Alpha audiences want to see more caring, affectionate, emotionally available men in movies and television. In fact, the most requested portrayals were fathers enjoying parenting and fathers showing love to kids. Nearly 60% of young people surveyed for this UCLA study wanted more fathers openly showing love and enjoying parenting, and 46% wanted more stories where men ask for help, including with their mental health. And Nacho Knots, this is not a small thing, because media does not just entertain us. Media rehearses us what we think is possible. For generations, boys have been given the same narrow set of images over and over. The lone hero, the emotionally silent father, the incompetent oafish father, the tough guy who solves pain with violence, the man who never asks for help, the dad who provides but does not connect, the boy who proves himself by hiding fear, tenderness, confusion, grief, sadness, sorrow. But this UCLA study suggests that young people are not simply asking for less masculinity. They're asking for different masculinities. They're asking for humane masculinities. They want fathers who show up. They want men who care. They want boys who can be brave without being cruel. They want male characters who can be strong and soft and protective and emotionally present, funny and vulnerable, flawed and still capable of repair. They want human representation. That connects beautifully to that APA article we just discussed. Because the APA article asked us to rethink masculinity for healthier psychological outcomes, and this UCLA piece shows us that young viewers are already hungry for those new models. And they're not waiting for permission from the old script. They're telling stories now. They're creating. They're becoming parents, educators, and culture makers. And they're going to give us men who are allowed to be human. And there is a neuro-affirming layer here too, people. Because autistic, ADHD, and otherwise neurodivergent boys often learn about acceptable masculinity through observation. They study the room. They study television. They study peers. They study adults. They look for the rules. And even when no one has written those rules down, they still search for them. And when the only available rule is be tough, be quiet, be normal, be cool, don't need too much, don't be too visible, don't cry, then neurodivergent boys may learn that belonging requires distance from themselves, denial of themselves. But what if the screen showed something different? What if boys saw fathers apologizing? What if they saw men asking for help before they hit a breaking point? What if they saw male friendship built on care instead of mockery? What if they saw a boy overwhelmed by noise, stress, rejection, or shame, and instead of becoming the punchline, he became the person others learned to understand? That would not just be better representation. That would be nervous system permission. Because when young people see tenderness modeled, tenderness becomes less dangerous. When they see fathers lovingly, openly being fathers, love and openness become less embarrassing. When they see men talking about mental health, help seeking becomes less like failure and more like wisdom. And this is where Nachos always comes back to the same core truth. People become healthier when the world gives them more livable scripts. A better script does not say there's only one way to be a man. A better script says there are many ways to be strong. You can be strong by protecting someone. You can be strong by listening. You can be strong by parenting with joy. You can be strong by going to therapy. You can be strong by saying, I was wrong. You can be strong by saying, I need help. You can be strong by staying soft in a world that keeps trying to turn softness into shame. So when UCLA tells us that young people want caring dads and vulnerable men on screen, I hear something hopeful. I hear young people asking for a culture where masculinity does not have to be a locked room. I hear them asking for doors. I hear them asking for windows. I hear them asking for fathers, brothers, teachers, friends, partners, and heroes who are not less masculine because they love openly, but are more fully human because they do. And this is where the conversation gets bigger than one book or one article or one study. Because masculinity is not an abstract idea floating around in a sociological classroom. Masculinity shows up in our homes, in our schools, in our politics, in our algorithms, in our dating lives, in our workplaces, in the stories we tell each other about strength, success, anger, loneliness, family, fathership, leadership, and even love. And right now, if we are honest, society is giving boys and men a deeply confusing set of messages. On one hand, we're finally talking more openly about mental health, consent, emotional intelligence, trauma, loneliness, and the harm caused by rigid gender roles. That's good. That's necessary. And it's long overdue. But on the other hand, a lot of boys and men are hearing that conversation through the distorted machine of the internet. They're not always hearing you deserve to be whole. They're hearing you're the problem. They're hearing the backlash version. Everyone is against you. So harden yourself, dominate others, never apologize, and then call that freedom. And that's not healing. It's a trap. It's a trap. Because when boys and men feel ashamed, isolated, economically anxious, socially confused, emotionally under-equipped, or afraid of being left behind, there will always be someone ready to sell them a costume and call it an identity. And that costume might look like dominance or cruelty or never needing anyone. A costume might look like mocking vulnerability. It might look like confusing aggression with confidence. The costume might look like turning every relationship into a scoreboard. But underneath all of that, very often, is pain that never learned how to speak in a softer language. And this matters because the loneliness data keeps telling us that something is wrong. That 2026 APA poll found that 42% of adults reported feeling lonely at least once a week. And that's up from 33% the previous year. A recent systemic review in Frontiers in Public Health also connects male loneliness with depression, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, suicide risk, and increased mortality, while noting that many interventions still do not fully account for how gender socialization shapes men's withdrawal and our personalization and disconnection from other people. So when we talk about masculinity, we're not talking about vibes. We're talking about health. We're talking about belonging. We're talking about whether a boy grows up believing that he's allowed to need comfort. We're talking about whether a man can call a friend before the crisis becomes unbearable. We're talking about whether fathers know they can be affectionate without losing their authority. We're talking about whether students, workers, veterans, caregivers, partners, sons, brothers, and friends have permission to be fully themselves and fully human. And current events keep showing us the stakes. We see it in the way public figures perform toughness instead of accountability. We see it in the way social media rewards outrage more than repair. We see it in the way that young men are targeted by influencers who package resentment as wisdom. We see it in the way every conversation about gender can become a battlefield before it becomes a bridge. We see it in the way boys are often offered two bad options: either become a villain people fear, or become so harmless, silent, and self-erasing that no one has to deal with your pain. But there is a third way. And the third way is where NACHOS lives. We don't have to shame boys and men into becoming better people. We don't have to excuse harm because someone is hurting either. We can hold both truths. Pain deserves care. Harm requires accountability. Loneliness deserves compassion. Cruelty still needs boundaries. masculinity does not need to be destroyed. It needs to be expanded. It needs more room for tenderness, more room for disabled men, more room for neurodivergent men, more room for queer men, more room for fathers who love loudly, more room for boys who are sensitive, intense, creative, anxious, brilliant, awkward, gentle, unsure, and still becoming. More room for men who are tired of being told that their only acceptable emotions are anger, ambition, and lust. Because when a society gives men only one emotional exit ramp, anger, we should not be surprised when every traffic jam becomes a pileup. And that's why this conversation matters so much. The question is not whether masculinity survives. The question is what kind of masculinity helps people survive without losing themselves. A masculinity rooted in domination will always require someone to be beneath it. But a masculinity rooted in care can build something. A family, a friendship, a classroom, a workplace, a movement, a life. And maybe that is the invitation for this week, Nacho Knots. To stop asking boys and men to choose between being strong and being soft. Maybe the real work is helping them become strong enough to stay soft. So before we close this section, I want to turn directly to my students for a moment. A gentle reminder. Your midterm is due on Wednesday, and there is no question for this week. So take a breath. You don't have to panic. You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be. The purpose of the midterm is not to trick you, trap you, or see how perfectly you can sound like a textbook. The goal is to show me that you're thinking about the material, making connections, and engaging with the course in a meaningful way. So give yourself enough time, watch the film, take notes, look back at your questions, use your own words, and be specific. Be thoughtful. But remember, it's an open notes assignment, which means you're allowed to support your memory instead of trying to carry everything in your head at once. So for my neurodivergent students, busy students, overwhelmed students, my I meant to start earlier but life happened students, hear me clearly. Start where you are. Open the assignment. Read the first question. Write one sentence. Then write another. Momentum often comes after we begin, not before. And if you're behind, shame will not help you catch up. A small next step, though, will. So you can do this, not magically, not perfectly, not in some imaginary version of yourself who has color-coded notes in a quiet home and no stress. You can do this as the real person you are right now, with the time, energy, and focus that you currently have. So this is your reminder and your encouragement. It's due Wednesday. Give it care, give it attention, give it your honest effort. Then let that be enough. And for everyone listening, students, Nacho Knots, friends, community members, and folks who have just wandered in because the algorithm handed you a plate of emotional support nachos, thank you for being here. If this episode spoke to you, please take a moment to like, follow, subscribe, share, or leave a comment wherever you're watching or listening. Those small actions really do help people see this work. They help us find a parent who needed a gentler way to understand their child. They help us find the student who thought they were the only one struggling. They help us find that teacher, advocate, caregiver, or neurodivergent adult who needed to hear that access is not asking too much. And they help us keep building the Nachos community one conversation at a time. So share this episode with someone who cares about neurodivergence, disability, pride, masculinity, education, parenting, mental health, or just making the world a little more humane. Send it to a friend, post it to a group chat, drop it in the family thread, and then mute notifications for your own nervous system's protection. That counts as self-care too. And as always, you can follow along with Nachos in the larger work of the Humanities 101 Foundation at humanities101.org. That's where you can learn more, support the mission, stay connected as we continue building spaces rooted in dignity, access, belonging, and joy, and even sign up for our summer ticket giveaway. Speaking of that larger work, right? I also want to share something that I'm really excited about and that I'm so excited to tell you. There will, this year, be a second annual Michigan Disability Empowerment Conference, and it will happen in October 2026. After the energy, connection, and community that came out of the first gathering, it feels deeply meaningful to know that this work is continuing, because disability empowerment is not a one-day event. It's a movement. It's a network. It is people finding one another, learning from one another, advocating beside one another, and refusing to let access and inclusion become occasional talking points. We're going to make them everyday commitments. And while I will be overseas during that time for my Fulbright work in Central Asia, the momentum will absolutely continue. And that matters to me, because the whole point of this work has never been that one person has to carry everything. The point is to build something strong enough, wide enough, and community rooted enough that the mission keeps moving even when one of us is in another time zone, probably trying to figure out jet lag, lecture notes, and where to find decent coffee. So that work continues because it needs to continue. The connection continues because the community is real. And the momentum continues because disabled people, neurodivergent people, self-advocates, families and educators, employers and allies all across this wonderful state of Michigan are still showing up for one another. So stay tuned for more details about the Michigan Disability Empowerment Conference, which will be coming back for year 2 here in October 2026. And again, I may be overseas, but I'm still helping coordinate promotion, supporting speakers, and keeping the message moving. Because access does not stop at a border. Community does not disappear because of distance, and empowerment does not pause just because one of us has to pack a suitcase. So as we bring this episode towards a close, Nacho Knots, let's take a moment to gather the threads we've been carrying together. We began with June as a doorway, not a deadline, not a demand, not a productivity contest in flip-flops, just a doorway, a chance to pause, breathe, notice what we have survived, and ask what might help us feel a little more human this week. From there, we reflected on that Hemingway idea of true nobility. The point that it is not to become superior to other people, but to grow with grace beyond earlier versions of ourselves. Not through shame, not through comparison, but through compassion, honesty, and the courage to keep becoming. And that led us into the work ahead. Disability Pride Month in July, Breaking Barriers celebration on July 23rd, 2026. My Fulbright lectures on American culture and America's 250th anniversary, and the larger question of who gets included in the story of this country. We also talked about the upcoming book, the recent manuscript I submitted, and how that work connects to the same mission that's at the heart of NACHOS. Dignity, access, belonging, neuro-affirming care, and the belief that tenderness is not weakness. Then we turned towards the larger question of masculinity. We looked at the APA's conversation about rethinking masculinity for healthier outcomes and the UCLA study showing that Gen Z and Gen A want more caring, affectionate, emotionally available men and fathers on screen. We connected those ideas to neurodivergent boys and young men, especially the way masking, shame, and rigid gender expectations can pile on top of one another. And we asked a deeper question. What kind of masculinity helps people survive without losing themselves? Not domination, not emotional silence, not cruelty dressed up as confidence, but care, repair, accountability, friendship, help-seeking, fatherhood, softness, strength that does not require someone else to shrink. We also took a moment to remind my students that the midterm is due Wednesday and that they don't need to panic. They just need to start. And finally, we talked about the work continuing beyond this episode, liking, following, sharing, supporting the Humanities 101 Foundation, and the exciting news that the MiDDC, the Michigan Disability Empowerment Conference, will return for a second year in October. So again, the momentum, the work, the mission will continue. So maybe the whole episode comes back to this. We do not build a better world by hardening ourselves. We build it by becoming more honest, more compassionate, more connected, and more willing to make room for one another. That's the work. That's the doorway. And Nacho Knots, I'm grateful we get to keep walking through it together. So before we go, let's end the way we try to end each week, not with pressure, but with affirmation. So take what you need from these and leave the rest. If June feels like a doorway, you don't have to sprint through it. If your routines are shifting, your nervous system is not being dramatic. Change is real, even when the calendar calls it summer break. If you're comparing yourself to other people, you're allowed to come back to your own path. Your growth is not measured against someone else's highlight reel. If you're trying to become better than your former self, please remember that growth does not require cruelty. You can become more honest, more grounded, and more courageous without shaming the person you used to be. If Disability Pride Month is approaching with joy, grief, anger, hope, or all of the above, there is room for that. Pride is not pretending that barriers do not exist. Pride is remembering that barriers were never proof of your worth. If you're a disabled person, a neurodivergent person, a self-advocate, or someone still finding language for your own experience, you belong in this story, not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, not as an inspirational prop, as a whole freaking human being. If you're a boy, a man, a father, a son, a teacher, a student, or someone trying to understand masculinity in a healthier way, you don't have to choose between strength and softness. You can be strong and tender. You can be accountable and still worthy of care. You can ask for help and still be brave. You can repair harm without drowning in shame. You can love openly without becoming less of yourself. And if you are raising, teaching, mentoring, or loving a neurodivergent boy, may you remember this. The goal is not to harden him into survival. The goal is to help him grow with enough safety, support, and compassion that he doesn't have to abandon himself to belong. For my students, if the midterm feels big, start small. Open the assignment, read the question, write the first sentence. You don't need a perfect brain to do meaningful work. You need a beginning, a little support, and enough grace to keep going. And for all of us, as we move through June, which is Pride Month, towards July, which is Disability Pride Month, and towards the work of breaking barriers for all of us, telling fuller stories for all of us, building better systems for all of us, and imagining more humane futures for all of us, may we carry this with us. You are not behind. You are becoming. You are not a machine. You're allowed to need rest. You are not too much. You're a person with needs, limits, gifts, rhythms, and worth. You do not have to earn belonging by becoming easier to ignore, and you don't have to become hard to become strong. Stay soft where you can. Set boundaries where you must. Ask for help when you need it. Offer care when you have it. And remember, rest is still revolutionary. Access is still love in action. Community is still how we survive. And you, exactly as you are today, are enough. That's our episode for this week, Nacho Knots. Thank you for spending this time with me, for thinking deeply, for caring openly, and for continuing to build a community where neurodivergent people are met with dignity, access, compassion, and joy. If this episode helped you, moved you, challenged you, or gave you language for something you've been carrying, please like, follow, subscribe, comment, and share. These small actions help us reach more people who may need this conversation. You can follow Nachos and support our work the Humanities 101 Foundation at humanities101.org. And remember, until next time, you're not a machine. Rest is revolutionary. Access is love in action. Community is how we survive. And you are enough. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you next time on the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for Outreach and Support. Have a good week.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.